Welcome to Amir Shakil 5858, the War and Love Report. I am Amir Goodnam. Today's headlines: Hurricane Hillary and tornadoes. Maui emergency chief resigns. Biden's historic summit at Camp David with Japan and South Korea's leaders. Trump is skipping GOP debate for the trial. F-16 jet fighters training for Ukraine pilots. And meals for wildfire-affected Maui residents. The impact of wildfires is being felt on two fronts today. On Maui, residents are trying to rebuild their lives days after fire scorched parts of the island as they mourn the many lives lost. But for one city in Canada's Northwest Territories, the fire danger is only just beginning. Traffic lined the only highway out of Yellowknife today, while other residents packed airports amid urgent orders to evacuate. One Yellowknife resident said that they had never seen anything like it, and they had never heard anyone speculate that in our lifetime something like this would happen. It's a race against time. A wildfire rages just a few miles north of Yellowknife, the capital of Canada's Northwest Territories and home to some 20,000 people. Forecasters say strong winds could push the flames into the city by the weekend. This year has been the worst wildfire season in Canada's history. More than 51,000 square miles have been burned so far. That's far more than the country's average wildfire season, which typically scorches 9,000 square miles. The wildfire danger also extends to British Columbia as a heat wave is bringing sweltering temperatures. Cliff Chapman, Director of Wildfire Operations, British Columbia, said this weather event has the potential to be the most challenging 24 to 48 hours of the summer from a fire perspective. They are expecting significant growth and they are expecting our resources to be challenged. Meantime, on Maui, local authorities are facing scrutiny after last week's wildfire wiped away the entire town of Lahaina, seemingly without warning. A reporter asked the question to the medical emergency chief that did he regret not sounding the siren? He replied he did not. He said sirens were primarily used for tsunamis, and that's the reason why. The emergency chief had resigned yesterday, citing health reasons. That is, as relief efforts continue, those whose homes were spared are banding together to help in any way they can. Nobriga, a resident of Lahaina, said it's a touchy situation right now because for us as a community, of course, we are happy that we have our homes, but our heart aches because that's our other neighbors and our families. Officials says that the search for victims continues with more than 1,000 people still missing as of today. President Biden is scheduled to visit the island on Monday. More than 466,000 acres across the U.S. have been burned this year by wildfires as of July 2023. A Category 4 hurricane brewing over the Pacific Ocean could weaken and become the first tropical storm to reach Southern California in 84 years. It's currently located off Mexico's western coast, packing sustained winds of 130 miles per hour. Forecaster expects it to weaken by the time it hits Southern California on Sunday. It could bring heavy rain and flash floods to the state and other parts of the southwest. Parts of the Spanish island of Tenerife are engulfed in flames and thick smoke tonight. It's the worst wildfire the area has seen in decades, burning through the wooded hillsides that make it a major tourist destination in the Canary Islands. As firefighters race to contain the blaze, nearly 8,000 people in the affected regions were left fearing for their homes. Hernandez, a Tenerife resident, said that their lives were left there. Human lives are more important, obviously, but it could have been avoided. And they believe that not enough has been done to prevent it from getting here. That is the sorrow they have. No, it's our life. It's our roots, the work of our relatives, of our parents. The Canary Island, like much of Midland Spain, had been suffering through droughts for the past few years. The hot and California coastline is in reach of tropical storm Hillary. Let's see, report by meteorologist Melissa Griffin of ABC. Melissa, what is mean exactly for Southwest and what's the timeline here?
Well, Alexis, it really is such a rare tropical weather event with this tropical storm watch issued for Southern California, including San Diego, for the first time ever. Now, Southern California has seen tropical storms and their impacts from them, but the last time a tropical storm made this kind of track over Southern California was back in 1997. Flood watches issued across the entire Southwest, but here's the current satellite. It is such a strong hurricane, Category 4 with winds up to 145 miles per hour. As Hillary barrels up towards the southwestern U.S., it will weaken. That is the good news. By Sunday morning, already down to a Category 2, but looks to remain tropical storm status as it heads into Southern California by Sunday into Monday. That's what I think the worst of the rain is going to be. Sunday afternoon through Monday morning, some spots could see 2 to 4 inches of rain widespread, but other areas, especially in higher elevations, could see up to 10 inches, Alexis, and that could bring flash flooding, extreme rainfall, mudslides, and debris flows. We'll be watching this very carefully as we head into the weekend.
Continues to be a summer of extreme weather. Melissa Griffin, thank
Yesterday, President Biden hosted the first ever trilateral summit with the leaders of South Korea and Japan. The president is hoping to build a united front in the Pacific against urging threats from China and North Korea. It all took place at Camp David, the presidential retreat where it wears to see reporters, and that's where we find for an unprecedented meeting the first standalone summit ever between the leaders of the US, Japan, and South Korea. The world would be safer as we stand together. President Biden insisted this summit was not about China, and yet the three leaders released a statement today condemning China's, quote, dangerous and aggressive military moves in the South China Sea. They also agreed to a series of measures aimed at countering Chinese economic coercion and North Korean nuclear provocation. When other nations seek cooperation in the region. They make judgment about would they be better off if they make commitments. President Biden has been quoting these two leaders for years, working to overcome a century of mistrust between their nations, a legacy of Japanese colonization. Yesterday, three leaders agreed to hold annual trilateral summits, step up joint military exercises, and establishes a three-way hotline to be used in times of crisis. A clear example would be if North Korea conducted particularly provocative test. Mira Hopper, President's Senior Director for East Asia, said we would use the hotline to pick up the phone and to discuss with one another what step we could like to take to respond. China had a response to all of this today. Attempts to form various exclusive groups and cliques are unpopular. A Chinese spokesperson warned it will definitely spark vigilance and opposition. President Biden did say today that he is hoping to meet with Chinese President in the fall, but there is a concern for the White House tonight. Officials say that recent military tests suggest that North Korea is getting help with its nuclear program from Russia.
A top-level Israeli delegation is here in Washington this week to discuss the broad outlines of a once unthinkable agreement between Israel and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to normalize diplomatic relations. Nick Schifrin explains.
Several agreements shepherded by the Trump administration between Israel and its former adversaries comes now the prospect of the biggest prize. But at what price for Israel, the United States, and Saudi Arabia? At the same time, unprecedented civil upheaval grips Israel as Benjamin Netanyahu's government looks to restrain the country's Supreme Court in what its critics say could destroy the nature of Israeli democracy. With me now to discuss this and more is the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer. Ambassador Dermer, thanks very much. Welcome to the NewsHour. As I said, among the topics that you are here in Washington to discuss is the possible normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which U.S. officials tell me they are prioritizing, hoping in the next year. And part of that would be allowing Saudi Arabia to have civil nuclear capacity, including enrichment. Does the Israeli government support that?
Like so many things, the devil's in the details, and we're going to have to look at what ultimately is agreed upon. And you're right, the Saudis have put that, a civilian nuclear program, which you probably are aware of. They, as signatories of the NPT, they could go to China, or they can go to France tomorrow, and they could ask them to set up a civil nuclear program and to allow for domestic enrichment. They could do that tomorrow if they wanted to. So the question that I ask myself is, if the U.S. is involved in this, what will that mean 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, and what's the alternative?
And there are other issues the Saudis have put forward as well.
But it sounds like you're not against it, certainly. And that is not necessarily the policy of the Israeli government over the last few decades. There's been a long tradition opposing nuclear expansion in the region. It used to be known as the Begin Doctrine. After Menachem Begin, of course, former prime minister, founder of the Likud party, who, of course, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is a member of, Begin bombed an Iraqi nuclear reactor to prove his doctrine. Does this Israeli government believe the Begin Doctrine no longer applies?
No, the Begin Doctrine definitely applies. You have countries in the region that can have civilian nuclear power. That's a different story than a nuclear weapons program.
You're also, of course, asking for something. The Prime Minister's former National Security Advisor, Mayor Ben Shabbat, said this: Saudi Arabia joining the nuclear club would produce a widening of nuclear proliferation in the region. Other countries would work to acquire uranium enrichment capabilities in their own territory. So, what does Israel want in exchange for that?
We're not going to agree to any nuclear weapons program with any of our neighbors. And the question will be, when it comes to the details of an agreement, what are the safeguards? And what happens if they take another path, if they take a path with the Chinese or something else? We have to think through that whole thing. But let's not underestimate the impact that an Israeli-Saudi peace agreement could have on the region and the world. I think if you get a Saudi-Israeli peace, you're going to have several other Arab countries and Muslim countries are going to follow.
Sure, but
I think it's the ultimate game changer.
But we also have to deal with the Palestinians. Of course, Saudi Arabia will demand significant concessions from Israel when it comes to the Palestinians. Let me give you some options. Ending illegal settlement activity, curbing especially large settlements, strengthening the Palestinian Authority, and expanding the territory under its jurisdiction. Are you willing to give any or all of that to the Saudis?
Well, this may surprise you, but I'm actually not going to negotiate on PBS. What we'll do, I will say the way we look at this issue, it's not just this or that price for Israel. We would like to ultimately achieve a peace agreement with our Palestinian neighbors.
Saudis are making clear there's no peace with Saudi Arabia until there are these concessions for the Palestinians.
I don't think they've been specific about what concessions.
They haven't, which is why I gave you some options.
I think what Saudi Arabia looks at this move with the United States is something that will anchor their alliance with America for a half century. And I think we both have an interest in seeing if we can get the Palestinians on a path which can ultimately lead to a political settlement of the conflict.
Let's talk about judicial reform. These are efforts the Prime Minister describes as reforms to Israel's, quote, all-powerful judiciary. Right. You represent the government coalition that's negotiating with the opposition in the President's House in Israel. In the United States, as you know well, if the House of Representatives, by a small majority, wants to abuse the rights of the minority, it would pass a law that goes through the House, through the Senate, signed by the President of the United States, goes through the federal court system, the Supreme Court, as guaranteed by the Constitution. In Israel, if the Knesset, if the Parliament, wants to impose its majority on the minority, there's only one check: the Israeli Supreme Court. Why are you trying to remove that check?
Well, we're not trying to remove the check. I think there's been a lot of misreporting on that. There are many checks that the Supreme Court has on the authority of the executive branch and even on the Knesset. When a law is passed, they can decide whether the law there's a conflict of interest, whether there was due process, whether it's proportionate, all these other checks. But there was an extra check that you don't have in your system here, which is the judges could decide, we don't believe this is reasonable. In Israel, you cannot replace the will of the public elected through their elected representatients with 15 unelected judges to decide that this is reasonable or unreasonable.
Since you've been pushing this through, there's obviously been massive unprecedented protests across the country. The shekel's lost value, private capital inflows are down, Israel startups are registering abroad, Moody's, S&P have warned about investing in Israel, and of course the military in Israel have repeatedly warned there is a crisis of readiness because of the fissures that your reforms have created in society, and because reservists are now threatening not to show up. So is that not a failure of leadership by Prime Minister Netanyahu?
No, I don't think so. I think, unfortunately, some of these protesters have crossed lines that should never be crossed. We're a citizens' army in Israel. The army should have never been brought into it. And
wait, are you criticizing individual members for protesting at all?
No, of course not. Protest is a fundamental right in every democracy. What I don't think you should do, military reservists should not come to an elected government and say, if you don't adopt this or that policy, we're not going to serve.
But you have Israeli military leaders warning the Prime Minister that this is a readiness issue. That's more than just the question of individual reserves.
Because the military reservists have decided that they're going to dictate the policy.
And the military leaders have said there's a
But
significant
the people who make decisions in a democracy are not military reservists or military officials. It's the elected branch of government, and that's Israel's democratic leaders that have to make that decision.
And for the first time in its history, next month, the entire 15-judge Israeli Supreme Court will hear an appeal against the law that curbs its own powers. Will you respect their decision?
Israel's a country of the rule of law, so we'll always abide by law. But it's important to understand. It's important to understand that the judges cannot be above the law. What's the authority? What's the authority that gives the power of the Supreme Court to decide to nullify a basic law? It's never happened in Israel's
history. That's correct.
history.
It's never happened. It's also never happened that the Supreme Court has to hear a case about curbing its own powers. So again, will you abide by the court? Will you abide by the court ruling?
The Prime Minister put out two principles. He said the government should always respect decisions of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court should never be above the law.
Ambassador Ron Dermer, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching and privilege of your time. This is Amish Shakil 5858. I am Amir Budna.